Everyone, hi. This is a continuation of our likeness sculpting in Blender class where we have been starting to work on an Emily Blunt likeness. Our goal for today's class is to take our head that's at about the 80% mark and to bring it over from 80% over to 90%. This is also what I like to call the second pass on a head, keeping in mind that we will do a total of 3 passes to capture the likeness properly. The first pass brought us from 0% to 80%, and it took us a few hours to do that. And for our second pass, then, we are going to go from 80% over to 90%. And it's going to take as much time to do so as the amount of time that it took us to reach the 80% mark. And finally, for our third pass, we'll go from the 90% mark to somewhere around the 95%. And we will talk about how you can even increase your likeness even further over to 96, 97, 98% or so. The closer we try to reach perfection in terms of our likeness, sometimes the further away it seems to get, like a bit of a mirage. And the more that the tiny little differences between our own sculpt and our reference start to magnify in our mind. So it's kind of normal as we develop a likeness that it seems as if we can never truly get there. But as long as we do steady progress, then we are always inching slightly closer and slightly closer. Likeness sculpting is really a matter of patience, observation, and perseverance. The closer we want to get to perfection, the more it's going to ask of us in terms of time, in terms of concentration, in terms of focus on really understanding the extremely subtle, minute differences. So what we're going to do today for this second pass is that we're going to look at 3 different observation techniques that you can use to help you improve your sculpt. It's very common once you do reach that 80% mark or so that we have reached with our first pass over this head, that your own observation skills start to fail you a little bit. And what I mean by that, okay, is that when we were doing our first pass over the head, we were keeping our references and our 3D model completely separate. We weren't overlaying them on top of each other because we really wanted to be developing our own artistic eye, our own sense of observation. So it's very normal if you reach this point and you're struggling a little bit to really start to spot the differences between your own likeness and your references there. Or maybe you are able to spot some of the differences, but you're not quite able to go about addressing those properly. It's very normal if you're at this particular stage. Of course, the better you are at likeness sculpting, the further along you are able to go with your own observation alone. But sooner or later, we reach a point where we really need to start to introduce other techniques to help us to really increase that likeness. So I'm going to start by presenting to you 3 different techniques that will help you out once you do reach that point where your own observation alone is starting to be insufficient to really continue to match your likeness. And then once we've covered those 3 different techniques, then we will apply those on our Emily Blunt likeness, and we will bring our Emily Blunt likeness from 80% all the way to 90%. We will continue our likeness sculpting classes in the future, where we will take our head once we have reached that 90%, and we will talk about all the ways that we can go from 90% all the way to 95%. And it will be very, very important then that you have seen all the anatomy classes that are already on the website. So if you haven't seen those classes yet, that is totally fine. But before you do start the third pass class, if you will, on this Emily Blunt likeness, it will be very important that you have absorbed everything that you can from those facial anatomy classes. And then we will also talk about how to transfer over this particular head, which is still in a remesh stage. How can we take that particular head and transfer that over to a proper, clean topology on which we can use the multi-res modifier? Once that class is on the website and you want to do that earlier, you can actually go ahead and do that. There's really no hard rules here as to when should you transfer your topology over. But personally speaking, I like to wait a little bit longer. So that's what we are going to do. So that's all content that will be waiting for us in the future, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have to do the second pass on this particular head. So there's 3 tools that I want to present to you today to really help you increase that likeness percentage. And the first one is exclusive to Blender. It's not something that we can actually do within ZBrush. So I'm actually quite excited to talk about that. Because what we are going to do is that we are going to leverage the fact that Blender is a 3D software with true 3D cameras, and we are going to create multiple viewports that give us different points of view over a face that will closely match some of the references that we have. And while we are sculpting over our head and trying to inch ourselves closer to our references, we will use those different viewports to have a simultaneous feedback as to whether we are going in the right direction or not. The second tool that we will talk about is anthropometry. And although we've already talked about that a little bit, in this particular instance, we will delve really deep into anthropometry. We will do a very in-depth analysis of our facial measurements that we have. We will figure out where the key problems are, and we will talk about how to go about solving them. Because sometimes it's a lot easier to figure out what are the anthropometrical problems than it is to go about solving them. And sometimes it can even feel that in the process of solving our anthropometrical issues that we have, that we are actually moving ourselves away from our likeness as opposed to moving ourselves towards it. The thing about anthropometry is that it is objective, and therefore, if we are not within anthropometrical range for the different measurements that we have over a face, then we know, objectively speaking, that our face is simply off in terms of proportions. And finally, the third tool that I will present to you is one that you probably already are aware of and that you perhaps even use on a regular basis, which is that we will simply overlay two different pictures. We will take a picture of our own 3D model, we will take a reference that we have, and we will simply overlay them, and we will compare where the differences are. And I'm purposefully waiting a long time before I start to talk about that, because this is one of those tools that people start to over-rely on a little bit too much, like a bit of a crutch, a little bit like smoothing. When people learn about smoothing, and if they start to smooth too early on in their own sculpting development, then that can become a crutch that actually holds them back from developing better tools that will help them create better results. So overlaying references on top of our 3D model and simply looking at where the differences are is extremely useful, and we would be fools not to use it. But we also don't want to over-rely on that to the exclusion of everything else as observational tools to help us improve our likeness. Once we're done presenting those three different tools, then we will put those into context and use them to improve our Emily Blunt likeness sculpt from that 80% mark over to that 90% mark. So that's what we have in store for today. There's a lot to go through. Let's get started. So here's where we left off our Emily Blunt sketch. I have the head here, and you can see my PureRef here as well with all our references. So for the first technique, what we want to do is to duplicate this particular viewport that we have and match some of those references that we have here in terms of angles and in terms of field of view. And it's very beneficial, of course, if you have more than one monitor. If you only have one monitor attached to your computer, then you won't be able to use this particular approach. But it's extremely beneficial when we do character art sculpting to have more than one monitor. And I recommend to have at least two of them. A third monitor isn't essential, but two monitors is very useful to have. And it is necessary to have it for what I'm about to show you here. So I have a second monitor that you can see right now is completely blank. There's really nothing on it. And what we are going to do is that we're simply going to duplicate this particular viewport 4 times, and we are going to match some of those references that we have here. So that while we are continuing to sculpt over our reference, that we have 4 different points of view that we can use as feedback to know whether we are going in the right direction or if we are not going in the right direction. If we want to duplicate our current viewport with a particular view that we currently have in here, we simply have to go to View here within Blender, and then simply go to Area and click on Duplicate Area into New Window. And by doing so, our camera will be duplicated, as you can see, with the current angle that we have in there. And we can simply drag that over to our second screen. Let me resize this here a little bit. And the next thing that we want to do then is to simply select an angle from the list here that we have. It's not strictly necessary to stick to front view, profile, and then 3/4. In fact, If we are always sculpting only from those particular angles, then we will be missing out on a lot of subtleties that other angles could actually give us. This is one of my favorite angles that we have over the face right here, because we're actually looking at the face from the back here. It's kind of like a 3/4, but from the back. And we can actually appreciate all of the silhouette here of the jaw, of the cheeks, and even look at the proportion of the ear in relation to everything else, in relation to the skull. This is a beautiful angle, and this is really an angle that gives us a lot of very useful information that we really wouldn't otherwise be able to get if we only had front view, 3/4, and then profile view there. So that's a really, really cool angle. So let's actually start with that, okay? That's going to be our angle number 1. And then we'll choose 3 other angles that will be very useful for us. In fact, let's go ahead here and just duplicate our viewport 4 times so that we don't have to do that separately every time. Let me go here to view once again, and then let's go to area. Let's do a duplicate here. And I'm just going to do that 4 times here, or I have to do it. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. And I'm just going to do that here another time, and then yet another time afterward. There is, by the way, okay, if you play within Blender, and within this particular menu here, there is something here that's written toggle quad view. And although this looks like it is exactly what we want it to be, we have 4 different points of view and we can actually move all of these separately. I actually found that even though this almost seems to be exactly like what we need or what we're trying to set up, because we don't have individual control over the field of view in each of these viewports, even if we set them to perspective, although these are orthographic right now, but we could actually set them all to perspective viewports so that they're not orthographic. What I've actually found was that, unfortunately, we only have one field of view control for those 4 different angles that we have in here. And because all these references have been taken with different lenses, it means that each of these viewports actually has to wind up having a different field of view if you want to match exactly the references that we have. We need to have individual control over the field of view for these 4 different viewports. And I just wasn't able to figure out a way to do that. They're all, unfortunately, all attached to this one focal length value that is right here. So although this particular quad view seems to be what we are trying to do here, and it seems very promising upon first glance, I've actually found that it simply wasn't sufficient for what we are trying to do here. So let's get out of quad view here. Let me toggle this back, and we are back here with our lone perspective viewport. And let me just go ahead here and actually just resize these particular windows so that they all take about 1/4 of my screen here. And now what we want to do is to simply select angles from our references that we will use in this particular case. As I've said, I really like this particular angle that is here. So I'm just going to take this particular picture and I'm going to put it aside, okay, because we will put it in a slightly different place over our PureRef canvas here. So that will be image number 1 that we will use and that we will try to match. And then let's simply look right away for other angles that we find that are interesting. This one's really cool too, actually. Let's use this one here. This is, once again, a more or less uncommon angle. We're not really used from looking at faces from this particular angle, but it's very, very, very good because we can appreciate the depth of some of these facial features, the shape of the nose. This gives us information that we really wouldn't otherwise be able to get from the standard front 3/4 and then profile view. Now, it is very useful, of course, to have a 3/4 view in there. So let's use this one here. This is a more standard reference that you would use as a 3/4, but this will work really, really well. It gives us a lot of very useful information as well. And finally, we don't have a front view in here. This one is front-ish, so I think this can actually work as a front view. We have our 3/4. It wouldn't be a bad idea to have something that is somewhat from profile to match, to kind of complete the picture here of the face that we have. I kind of like this one here. Let's see what else do we have. This one here is also pretty useful. Her mouth is slightly open in this particular case, so I actually want to be wary of that. Everything else is a very, very strong profile that we could use. But the fact that the mouth is actually open kind of bothers me here a little bit. So what kind of other profile do we have? This one's really good too. Although, because we can't see the back of the head, maybe that's a little bit concerning, but it is a pretty good reference that we could definitely use. That's where you start to also realize that although we will have 4 viewports here that are distinct, we could actually, if we could have something like 8, that would be even better. If we had like a 3rd screen, we could actually set this up so that we have 8 individual viewports that all have a very different angle. That would be really, really cool. but in this particular case, we'll stick to 4. And okay, so I'm looking for something that's kind of a pretty good profile. I guess this one's pretty good. Let's go for this one here. So it's not completely profile, but as I said, that's okay. They don't actually need to be. And now what I'm going to do in PureRef here is that I'm just going to crop these particular pictures so that I have only the head and nothing else, because you'll see that with 4 viewports that are open at the same time and then 4 distinct references that are right next to those, this will get a little bit crowded. So we should try to make sure that everything is as small as it can on screen, or that takes the least amount of screen space that it can. So here within PureRef, I'm just going to hold down C on my keyboard, and I'm just going to do a click and drag here, and that will allow me to crop out everything about this particular picture that I don't want to keep around. So this focuses only on the head. That's wonderful. Let's do it again here. Now you could be tempted here to maybe crop out the skull and just keep only the mask of the face that is kind of visible. But I would rather not do that, because it is important to make sure that we have the proper skull shape, the proper skull size. And the size of the skull is also very important to help us judge what will be the proper field of view to use on these particular viewports there. So I actually kind of want to keep the skull around. So these two here, this one here, let's crop out only the head. Let's get rid of everything else. And then let's do this one last time. We have our 4 images now that are here. And now what we want to do is to overlay them next to each of these viewports so that we can see each individual reference next to its matching viewport. There's not much of an order, which one should be top left, top right. You can do these in whichever way that you want. And of course, it would become important now to have a transparent background within PureRef so that we can actually see Blender that is behind it. So it turns out that's actually very easy to do. Let's just right-click within PureRef. Let's go to our settings. And afterward, within colors here, let's look here where it says background color. Let's click on that. You don't have to change the actual color, but where it says opacity here, simply take that slider and bring it down to 0, as you can see. And that will actually make the background of PureRef completely transparent. But within the canvas, you can see that that is still looking opaque to us. So we want to take the canvas color afterward, take that and do the same thing. Take the opacity slider and put that down to 0. And now PureRef is fully transparent, as you can see. We can see the references clearly, but we are completely seeing through the canvas. If I'm clicking, I'm still clicking on PureRef, as you can see. I'm not actually clicking behind on Blender. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to take my PureRef window. I'm going to make it here as big as my screen is here. I'm just going to take the sides of the PureRef window here, and I'm going to make them as big as my screen is. So we have our 4 individual references here. And now what we want to do is to simply match them with a particular viewport. Let's say that we are going to use this particular reference here. Let's say we're going to use this one here at the bottom, and then this one here at the top, and this one here at the bottom right. PureRef now has a transparent background, but it doesn't mean that I can click through it to Blender that is underneath. As you can see, if I click somewhere, I'm still clicking on PureRef, even though it looks like I should be clicking on Blender. That is simply because we have made the background of PureRef completely transparent. If you want to actually click through PureRef and click on Blender that is behind it, it's actually very simple to do so. While your PureRef window is active, press Ctrl-T on your keyboard, and that will make PureRef transparent to your mouse. So if I do that here, I press Ctrl-T. Now you can see that now my cursor is actually affecting Blender as opposed to affecting PureRef. And even if I click on the reference directly, I'm still clicking on Blender. So if I want to move my references yet again, then I have to remove the transparent to mouse from PureRef. So here I'm simply going to select PureRef from our taskbar, and then I'm going to press Ctrl-T to get rid of the transparent to mouse function. And now I can move PureRef again. So with that shortcut, Ctrl-T, you can enable or disable the transparent to mouse feature of PureRef, which means that you can either click on PureRef or click on whatever is behind it very easily like that. This is getting really hot. Let me get rid of this particular coat that I have. And the other thing that we need to know at this point is how to make each of these pictures individually transparent so that we can overlay them over our Blender viewport and see the differences there. And to do that, you simply have to hold Control, Alt, Shift, hold those. And as you do a click and drag using the left mouse button, you will be able to make each of these individual pictures semi-transparent or fully transparent if you want to. Now, there's really two different things that we can do. One is that we can either wind up having our references here on the side and then have our 3D model that is visible here, or we can keep them overlaid on top of each other. But once again, I like to keep them separate because it actually helps us to train our own observation skills to really spot the differences. If you feel like you want to keep them overlaid on top of each other, I guess that's fine. It's not the end of the world. But personally speaking, I like to make things a little bit hard on myself because I know that it's through that difficulty that I usually grow and that I improve my own skills. But there's no hard rules here. You can do it however you want here. So what I want in the end is to have my references here on the right of each viewport and then on the left here of each viewport to have the actual 3D model that is there. Let's move our references over our 3D models. Let me hold Control, Alt, Shift down. Let's make each of these semi-transparent. Now, I actually want to keep a little bit of the skull in here. So even though we could be tempted to try and make this as big as this so that we can only see really the silhouette of the face there, I actually really like to keep the skull in there that is also visible. So we'll want to do that here. I don't want this picture to be too big, therefore. Let's press Control T, make PureRef transparent to mouse. And now let's move our individual cameras until we have matched these references as well as we possibly can. So there's a slight tilt. You can see there's a slight tilt as I'm matching the eyes here. There's a slight tilt to the model versus the reference. So as opposed to rotate the camera in this particular case, let me just select PureRef again. Take this particular image here, and then let me just rotate it here. So I'm going to hold down Control as I click on the image itself, and you can see then that I can actually rotate it around slightly. So I'm going to match the angle that we have on our viewport. Once again, Control T, let's click in Blender, and then let's continue rotating this around. We have to be just very careful with this. And when we have like big deviations in terms of skull size, it means that perhaps our field of view isn't quite what it needs to be. So let's go to View here and let's actually address this. Let me just zoom in here a little bit, make the focal length here a little bit higher. And as you can see, that actually makes the skull look bigger. That also changes the position of the ears. And you can see that that feels like we're getting a lot closer there. Now, of course, if I can never match the ear exactly, it may also be that I have proportional issues with this particular head, which would be very well expected at this particular stage. So we really want to match them as much as we can, all the while knowing that there will always be some type of difference here. See, like, I feel as if I may actually have an easier time finding out the subtle changes in angles that I need to give to the camera here if these are actually separated as opposed to overlaid. And I'm looking at how much of the nose or how much of the cheek can we see. So it's pretty close. How much of the side here of the mouth can we see? It's pretty close. The eyes, they seem to have, so right now they're completely straight here. In this particular case, they're not. So let me take the image here again, hold Control, and just rotate it until the eyes are perfectly straight. So that looks pretty close, right? I feel as if I'm still getting more perspective distortion in my viewport than what I'm getting here. I'm kind of looking at how the eyes are aligned and I look at the mouth afterward. It feels like they are both converging to a vanishing point that is closer to our reference right now than what I can observe here on our reference. If I look at if I draw an imaginary line between the two eyes here, we have a line here that seems to be perfectly straight. And if I look at the mouth, it's also almost perfectly straight. Whereas on our viewport here, you can see that those two imaginary lines would converge to a vanishing point that is much closer So my field of view is definitely too high, or my focal length is too low. So let's go ahead and make that even bigger. Let's go to about 80 or so. Yeah, see, that feels better, right? I'm even wondering if I shouldn't go even higher than that, to be honest. Let's actually try like going like up to like 100. Let's see what it starts to look like once we do that here. So let's go at about 100. Probably don't want to go higher than that, but in this particular case, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. Yeah, this feels pretty good to me. You can already see that there's major differences in terms of ear, in terms of orientation. So we will be wary about relying too much on the ear to really tell us whether our head is in the proper spot or not, our reference is in the proper spot or not. See, we're really, really close now. This is very, very close. Oh yeah, see how nicely the silhouette seems to match right now. This is really beautiful. Pretty good, right? You can see that the ear is definitely not in the proper spot right now. It's a very big deviation here in terms of position of the ear. But the features all match, like my eyes are where they need to be. Some slight differences here in terms of nose height that we can spot right away. Our mouth is at the proper height, our eyes at the proper height, but our nose is not. So our nose needs to be slightly brought up a little bit. Our silhouette is very closely matching. You can see minor differences already in terms of silhouette, but for the most part, this is already very, very good. So let's say that image number 1 is where it needs to be here. So that's pretty good. Let me take the image and move it back at the spot at where it was before. Let me just crop it again just to get rid of a little bit of the parts of the image that I really don't want to keep. It's not a bad moment to save our PureRef window so that if we close PureRef and reopen it, these particular references wind up at the exact same spot that they currently have. So let's do a save as. And let's just save this out as, let's call it QuadView. Let's save Blender as well. So now I want to match this particular angle that is here. Once again, let me actually start by putting these on the side because I do find that it's slightly easier to match them in the beginning if they are separate as opposed to being completely overlaid. So let me just go ahead and do that. Let me afterward rotate my camera. So we need an angle that is slightly like this. Once again, our perspective distortion, we can see that it's way too pronounced right now. So once again, let me go to view here. Let me just move this out of the way. And let's go for an 80mm lens in this particular case, and we will adjust that as needed. Let's match this particular angle. Once again, you can see how big of a difference we have in terms of perspective here. And the fact that I can see a lot more of the ears on the side means that the camera was using a longer focal length than what I have. So let's go ahead and address that here. I guess we'll go for a 100mm lens once again. Match the angle, perhaps zoom out a little bit. Ears seem to match a lot better now. If I put the 2 eyes in the same spot, I should be able to make it so that the mouth winds up in the same spot while keeping a very similar size to our skull here. Now, there is something that's a little bit tricky about this particular reference though, because she is looking down towards the camera as opposed to looking straight ahead. So we actually have to accept the fact that we won't be able to match the eyes perfectly because the fact that she's looking down means that her lower eyelids are shorter than what they would be if she was looking straight ahead. So it's actually normal for us to not be able to match the eyes 100% because the angle of gaze is actually a little bit different. All right, so our mouth is in the proper position. The nose also seems to be where it needs to be. The size of the skull seems to match. Although in this particular case, I feel as if I should be seeing a little bit more of the skull on the 3D model if I compare it with the reference. So I am tempted to bring this focal length here just a slightly higher. So let's actually do that. Yeah, see, maybe around 105 or so. I think that may actually match better. I'm starting to feel pretty good about this. All right, that's pretty good. See, we're actually really close. As we said, the eyes aren't where they need to be because, well, first of all, it's very possible that my eyes really aren't where they need to be to begin with. But second of all, our 3D model is looking straight ahead, and on the reference, she's looking down. So that will obviously mean that the eyes will wind up being significantly different. But there seems to be more than that going on as well. It almost looks as if the eyes need to be pushed in a little bit. They're not as deep as they need to be when I compare these two. So that's something we'll have to address later on. But our nose seems to match, our mouth seems to match. The neck seems to be in the same position. The shape of the skull seems to be very consistent too. So I think this is good enough for now. As we said, we can tweak this later, of course. We can fine-tune the exact orientation of the head as much as we need later on. So this is good enough for now. I'm not going to complete these because the next two ones would be the exact same as what we have done so far. But I think that you can see what the workflow is. Now, I've already sculpted my second pass to this particular head. So here's what it actually looks like. And we're just going to fast forward here. I just want to show you what is the evolution of this particular head at different stages while using these 4 different viewports here. You can see that the changes are actually very subtle, but that they do matter quite a lot in capturing our likeness here. So what's the basic idea behind this approach anyway? Why are we doing this and where does that lead us? Well, the basic idea is that while we are sculpting on our main monitor and that we also have an instance of PureRef that is also open on our main monitor. So we actually have 2 instances of PureRef running at the same time. What we want to do is to analyze our 4 different viewports that we have and really figure out what are the differences between our references and our 3D models just by observation of these 4 different viewports. And what we want is to look for consistency. We want to look for suggestions of things that need to be improved that is consistent across as many views as possible. Because if we can find a change that needs to happen to bring those 4 different viewports or most of these viewports closer to their reference, then that's a great change that we want to be doing. If we are doing a change that seems to bring one viewport closer to its reference, but all the other ones seem to be moving away from their reference, then that change that we seem to think that is the right change to do in the moment is actually leading us astray, and we should be very wary of doing that particular change. Because it's very common while we do likeness sculpting that you will look at a particular reference, you will look at your 3D model, you will try to get yourself closer to that one reference that you are looking at that particular moment. But in the process of bringing your likeness closer to that one reference, unknowingly, you are actually moving away from the other references that you may have. You seem to be getting closer, but yet when you do compare your face to the other references that you have, you'll see that you've actually moved away from those. If we take the eyes and we move the eyes further in, if we move the eyes up, down, if we change the shape of the nose, whatever we do, we have to make sure that that change agrees with multiple points of view. I do like, once again, to keep my references separated, so not overlay my references with my 3D model, because I find that then I can actually see the 3D model, see the reference more clearly. And I just, once again, flicker my eyes back and forth between my references and my 3D models. And by flickering my eyes, I can actually spot the different relationships of every other feature around one feature. So let's say that I'll choose, let's say, the tip of the nose, okay? And I'm going to flicker my eye back and forth between the tip of the nose in both cases. And by flickering my eyes like that, all the other features around it, the mouth, the cheeks, the eyes, the silhouette, I can instantly spot many different differences. In fact, it becomes very clear to me just by flickering my eyes back and forth between the same point over my reference as over my 3D model. It becomes very clear to me that the nose actually needs to be slightly raised, needs to be brought up here, just very, very slightly. And also it seems to be pushed in a little bit too much. Somehow I feel as if I should take the nose and just pull it out just very, very slightly. I think it's fine too if at this particular stage, if you decide instead to take your references, overlay them, bring down the opacity and look at them like this and try to match the silhouette in different places. I think it's fine to do that, but as you've seen here too, it actually also makes things a little bit harder to read because you're looking at literally 2 different images at the same time. So it's fine to do that a little bit, but don't over rely on simply overlaying your references and just trying to match this 100% like that. After I'm done presenting to you the 3 different techniques that you can use to help you spot the differences between your 3D model and your references, then we'll take these 4 different views and we will go through the process of improving this particular sculpt step by step. The second technique I want to talk to you about is anthropometry. This is something that we have talked about previously, but in this particular case, we want to go really, really deep. Once again here, we will use our 2012 anthropometric survey of US Army personnel, methods and summary statistics that you can freely find online. It's within the public domain, so you can actually grab this through a very easy Google search of this particular name. And I want to tell you what are the exact measurements that are great to use to really test whether your head has the proper proportions or not. And we will go ahead and measure those together, and we will spot what are the key issues that we have to address. Within Blender, if you do want to measure the distance between 2 different facial features, let's go here to Object Mode. And once we're in Object Mode here, we'll simply have our little measure tool right there, or we can select that, hold down Control, click and drag on our model, and we can see what is the distance there between those 2 points here. And so the first one that we want to measure here, and what is for me one of the most important anthropometrical measurements that we want to acquire so that we can compare with the literature afterward, is the interpupillary distance, the distance between the 2 pupils. And so it's very easy to measure. We simply have to click and drag between the 2 pupils of our model, and the length that we will have there displayed will be our interpupillary distance on our 3D model. In this particular book here, you can find the interpupillary measurement on page 149 of this particular document. So let me just scroll down here. Let's go to page 149. Or even better, let's type in interpupillary distance. And here you go. I believe this is it here. So page 149. You'll find the anthropometrical chart here that gives us what is the normal range of human beings for this interpupillary distance here. So if we look here in the case of females here, we want to start by looking at what is the 50th percentile. So the 50th percentile is literally just the halfway mark. What is the most average value that we could get for this particular measurement here? And so here in females, it tells us that the interpupillary distance, or the interpupillary breadth, as they call it here, the distance between the 2 pupils here, at the 50th percentile, literally average of the population, that particular distance in centimeters is 6.2 centimeters. And the fact here that I have measured this to be 5.45 centimeters, so 0.8 centimeters under what the average should be very concerning for us. It means that that distance seems to be already very off here. There already seems to be something here that really needs to be addressed. But not only do we want to look at what is the average, of course, that's a great starting point, but most people aren't at the average. They're somewhere under that or over that particular average. So we want to also get a pretty good sense for what is the range then around that middle value that is kind of normal for the population, or in which most people fall, to see whether we also fall within that range or if we fall outside of that range. So in this particular case here then, what is our range? Well, if we go from, let's say, the 5th percentile, we could go all the way down to 1st, of course, but the thing about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, let's say all the way up to 5th, okay, is that it means that 5th percentile just means 5%. There are 5% of the population whose eyes are closer together than 5.55 centimeters. There is 5% of the population whose eyes are closer together, their interpupillary distance is smaller than 5.55 centimeters. So technically, okay, we have here a value of 5.45, as you can see, which means that we are technically within what is normal for humans, in the sense that our 1st percentile is at 5.35. But the fact still remains that 5.45 here is actually exactly the 3rd percentile. It means that right now, my sculpt, her eyes are as close together. There's only 3% of the population whose eyes are at that distance, or whose eyes are even closer than that. 3%, okay? The problem with saying that this is okay, because It is technically within the chart, even though it is so close to one of the borders there of the chart. The problem is that this is a very, very important outlier in terms of statistics. It should kind of be obvious to you when you look at a reference. It should kind of stand out to you as like, wow, they're really, really close together somehow. Because you're just not used to seeing people whose eyes are that close together. So that's why for me, like I try to be wary of the edges of a chart like this. Now, I do have this feeling that Emily Blunt has eyes that are closer together than the average of the population, but I'm not bothered by the distance between her eyes to the point that I feel as if somehow she's a statistical outlier. We want to use our critical judgment to judge by ourselves, okay, where should our measurement kind of lie in here? And of course, some of that is just simply experience. The more that you sculpt heads, the better you'll be at just judging whether someone falls within the average or is very far from the average in terms of statistics. You'll just develop a bit of a sense for that as you sculpt heads. You will develop a certain sense through time that someone's eyes, let's say, are slightly closer together than the average or slightly further apart than the average. By looking at a lot of faces, at some point, you'll just start to get a little bit of a feeling for that. Perhaps we could use something around the 25th percentile or the 30th percentile, somewhere around that, as a pretty good measurement for us to try and hit. So the fact that I'm 5.45 right now means that there's probably a pretty big issue here that needs to be addressed. But before I go ahead and try to address that, I really want to make sure that I have a full picture of how my head holds up as far as anthropometry is concerned. So this is not the only measurement that I want to use. I want to measure a whole bunch of other measurements on pretty much every axis, X, Y, and Z, to really get a very, very good idea of where my whole head is. Because it's very possible that our interpupillary distance is too low, but that if every other measurement out there are also a little bit too low, then it means that we have to do a different change to address that interpupillary distance than the change that we would have to do if only the interpupillary distance was too low, but everything else was where it needed to be in terms of proportions. I hope that makes sense. The changes that we need to do depend on other measurements as well. If you imagine that every measurement that you get are too low, then it's very easy to fix. You just need to take your head and you just need to scale it up a little bit. But if you realize that the problem is that the interpupillary distance is too low, but let's say the size of the skull is the size that it needs to be, then it means that the problem is that only the front of the face needs to be expanded, but you don't necessarily want to touch the back of the head there. So that's why we need more data before we can really confidently prescribe a change in this particular case. So we've talked about the size of the head then, so let's actually measure that next. Let's measure the head breadth, or the size of the skull, the width of the skull, in fact, at its widest point, which is slightly above and behind where the ear is. So once again, let's take our measurement tool. Let's control, click, and drag from this particular point to the same point on the other side. Then let me also just rotate my camera around and make sure that these points have snapped where I want them to snap on the surface. Let me just actually hold down control and just move this point here a little bit further towards the back and do the same thing on this particular side there. So that's pretty good. Okay, so we have here a measurement here. This is what we call the head breadth, or the size of the skull at its widest point. Some people think that it's actually the cheekbones, but that's a mistake because of perspective distortion. The cheekbones seem to be wider because they're further in the front than the back of the skull there. But the widest point of the head is right here. It's over and behind the ear. So right now we have a value of 15.3. So once again, let's look at our anthropometry to really compare that. And this is the second of the measurements that we want to measure here. And we will find the value that we were looking for on page 133 of this particular document. Let's go up here, and here we go. So head breadth. And once again, let's compare this. So 50th percentile, that's our starting point once again. 14.7. And you can see that we have a range. If we go from, let's say, the 10th percentile to the 90th there. So that's a pretty good range. 80% of the population falls within that. We go from 14.1 centimeter to about 15.4 centimeter. And we're at 15.3 centimeter right now. So we are at the 80th percentile. 80th percentile right now. That's kind of interesting, right? Although our interpupillary distance is at our 3rd percentile, so our eyes are very close together compared to most people out there. Our skull is at the same time wider than most people out there by a pretty significant margin here. We're at the 85th percentile. So there's definitely some type of perspective distortion that's probably built into the model right now, right? Where the back of our head is too wide and the front of our head is actually too narrow there. We probably have to make the skull a little bit smaller and also make the front of the face a little bit bigger there in comparison. So that's going to be a pretty interesting thing for us to fix later on. For the width of the head, I really like to go for just the straight 50th percentile almost every time, because when our reference has hair, it really becomes hard to really read the shape of the skull or the size of the skull. And it becomes hard to kind of guess whether our skull should be slightly smaller than the average, slightly bigger than the average. It becomes really, really hard to do that, right? So let's just go for the average every time. And let's just stick to that. Most people won't be good enough to be able to really tell whether someone's skull is bigger or smaller than the average anyway. So that should be fine for us. The next one that we want to look at is the depth of the head, or the length of the head. The depth meaning from the back of the skull all the way to the front of the skull. So that's going to give us some very good information as to whether our skull is the proper size or not on the depth axis, or in this case here, that would be either the Y or the X axis, depending on the software. In this particular case, that would be our Y axis. And so for the depth of the skull, or the length of the skull, depending on how you want to call it there, we'll go here to page 137 of this particular document. And here we have our head length here. And very important to always see where the measurement is taken from over the head. So here we are starting from in between, from the middle of the forehead here, just over a zone that we call the glabella. So we go from the glabella all the way to the furthest point back of the skull. And once again here, our 50th percentile, because we're measuring the skull, let's just go for the average really, should be at about 19 centimeters or so. So where are we right now? Let's go ahead and take that measurement. Let me hold down Control, click and drag, and then click and drag here to move this particular point here towards the furthest point back of the skull, which seems to be about here. If I compare with the reference, it should be about here or so, right? We don't want to go too high with this. So I'm about where I need to be. It feels to me like maybe we could flatten this up here a little bit, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. And our distance here is 18.74. And so 18.74 is actually about 38th percentile or so. This is actually pretty good. I really wouldn't worry about that too much. We could maybe make our skull just very slightly longer by a fraction of a centimeter, just to really match that 50th percentile. But for the most part, the depth of our skull is actually pretty good. So that really satisfies me. And that gives us a nice measurement over the Y. So all we're missing right now is measurements over the Z axis. And unfortunately, in this particular document, there is no one single measurement that gives us a very good appreciation for the height of the head. Instead, we have to combine two different measurements to get that particular picture there. So the two measurements that we will use, the first one will be from the chin all the way to what we call the scallion, or what is the kind of concavity that we have here just under the glabella, where we have the nose bridge right here. So this is the scallion right here. So from the scallion all the way down to a point over the chin that we call the menton, which is the furthest point down of the chin, which is usually a little bit under the chin. And you'll find that particular measurement here on page 165, this particular document. So our menton to scallion length, as you can see here, and once again, you can see where the calipers are placed precisely, so we can match that. So let's go ahead here and measure that once again. Click and drag here. Move this point here to the menton, the furthest point down. And once again here, so we have a value of 10.5 centimeters. Our 50th percentile here should be at about 11.30 centimeters. And once again, 10.5, that's closer to the, that's at about the 10th percentile. So once again, that feels a little bit low to me. I would have a tendency there too to just try to bring that a little bit closer to the average there. So we'll do that, but before we do that, let's get a complete picture of the height of our head. And the second measurement that we will use to complete this particular picture is from the trachyon, or this little piece of cartilage that kind of sticks out here from our ear, from there all the way to the top of the head. Now, this is actually simpler to do from front view because we don't want this particular measurement to wind up being at a diagonal. We actually want it to be completely straight. And by the way, we'll find this particular measurement here on page 207, I believe. So let's go down, 207. Here we go. So trachyon to the top of the head. And you can see where the calipers are placed here. We don't want to create a diagonal line here. We actually want to measure only the height of the trachyon to the top of the head. So let's hold control here, click on the little trachyon here. But as opposed to finish our click here over the top of the head, let me just keep it floating right here at about the height of the top of the head right here. And that looks pretty good to me. So we have 13.1 centimeter, 50th percentile here, 12.7. So what can we deduce from that already? Our trachyon to top of the head is at the 75th percentile, slightly higher than the average. Whereas our menton to celion length here was closer to the 10th percentile, so was lower than the average by quite a lot, right? So what are the conclusions we can draw from that right now? Well, either our skull is a little too high and we need to bring the top of the skull down a little bit, or we need to bring the ear up a little bit. And either our chin is a little bit too low, or our celion here, our nose bridge, is a little bit too high. In this particular case, though, I would probably want to address this the jaw and make the jaw slightly higher. I feel as if that would be an easier way to fix that than by taking the whole zone of the nose and the eyes and bringing those down. But we're really not far from where we need to be, right? Like, these are minor changes as opposed to, let's say, the change in interpupillary distance that needs to happen here. And finally, the last of the essential anthropometrical measurements that we want to introduce here to really get a very nice, complete picture of the proportions of our head is the bizygomatic distance. And bizygomatic is simply the distance at the widest point of the cheekbones. And in our trusty little book, we will find that distance at page 73. So let's go back up here to page 73. And here we have the bizygomatic breadth, as you can see. Now, this is a tricky one for a lot of people, I think, because we may have a tendency to think that the widest point of the cheekbones is actually further ahead. You know, like a lot of people would probably say that the widest point of the cheekbone is somewhere about here or so. And that's simply a consequence, once again, of perspective distortion within our references. We have a feeling that the things that are closer to the camera, because the camera is usually in the front, of course, they seem wider than anything that is further in the back because of perspective distortion. But it's really good to know that the widest point of the cheekbones is closer to the ear than it really is closer to the eye, as you can see, because the cheekbones actually slightly expand towards the back. The widest point of our cheekbones is actually about here as opposed to somewhere about here or so. And our measurement now, 12.9 centimeter. When we look at the literature here for females, 50th percentile, 13.4, 12.9 brings us down to the 20th percentile. That's really not too bad, okay? We can obviously make the cheekbones slightly wider to bring them closer to 50 or maybe even overshoot that. It does seem to me like Emily Blunt has cheekbones that are very wide. Depending on the angle, we can kind of tell that here if we look at just how wide this here seems to get, right? Like her cheekbones, they seem pretty wide. And we have a few angles here that really communicate that very clearly as well. When we look at her from behind, say that we look at this particular reference here, right? You can see just how much of the cheekbones really seem to stick out here on the side. Like she's got some really wide cheekbones there. So I feel as if we should probably be slightly higher than the average for the width of her cheekbones. But it can be very hard to appreciate that when we look at, let's say, this particular angle here, because the widest point of the cheekbones is actually further back here, right? well, we can actually tell because of the perspective distortion there. But I do feel as if her cheekbones are quite wide. So I probably wouldn't mind winding up somewhere around maybe, I don't know, 60 or 65, the 65th percentile, somewhere around there or so. This is not an exact science that we are going for, but this should be pretty good estimation there. So we may want to wind up somewhere around 13.5 centimeters to somewhere around there here for our bizygomatic distance. And right now we're at 12.9. So we can definitely gain a few millimeters here for the cheekbones. So those are what I consider to be the essential anthropometrical measurements that we want to use to make sure in an objective way that our head is at the proper size. It doesn't mean that these are the only anthropometrical measurements that we want to use. And later on in this class, as we do our second pass over this particular head, we will also want to introduce other anthropometrical measurements to calculate the palpebral fissure or the size of the opening of the eyes. We will also look at the eyes again, look at the size of the iris, all of that using anthropometry as the ground truth. And of course, the best way to learn what are the different anthropometrical measurements that you have at your disposal is to either carefully read through this particular document and look at what is in there, or sometimes you can also just Google anthropometry with a particular facial feature, anthropometry of the eyes, anthropometry of the eye opening, or what we call the palpebral fissure, anthropometry of the lips. I don't know, you can look at all, like you can find data on a whole host of other facial features or relationship between different facial features than the one that we are looking at right now. But once again, for me, these are the essential ones that you want to start with and measure every time. So what kind of conclusion can we draw from this so far? Well, the depth of our skull is actually pretty good. Sure, there's some slight differences here that we can address, but there's really nothing major here. So we've really hit the size of the skull that we needed in terms of depth. So that's super, super, super cool. The height of our skull is also pretty good. There too, there's some slight issues that we need to address, but there's really nothing major here. There's really nothing major that needs to be addressed. We can probably bring the ear up a little bit, but for the most part, the size or the height of our head is where it needs to be. Where it becomes a little bit trickier then is with the measurements on the face here, on the front of our head here. Our interpupillary distance is way lower than where it needs to be. There's a clear issue here that needs to be addressed. And because our skull, in terms of width, is higher than it should be, because our width of our skull is bigger than it should be, it means that we can't fix this interpupillary distance being too low by simply taking the whole head and scaling it up. We can't do that because then that would mean that we would be changing, of course, the depth of our head. That would become too deep. The height of our head would become too much. We can't fix our interpupillary distance issue by scaling the head up because the other measurements tell us that we're already at a pretty good spot. And in fact, the width of our head at its widest point is already too wide. So we need to do something where we need to expand, make the front of the face wider. We need to make the cheekbones slightly wider, which is good because we also need to make the eyes slightly further apart. So at least these two measurements seem to bring us in the same direction. But while we're doing that, we need to make the head, the width of the skull, slightly narrower at the same time. So we kind of have a pretty good picture here of the series of steps that we need to do, or the series of changes that we need to do so that everything starts to fit neatly within anthropometry there. So once again, once we get to the voiceover part of this particular class, then we will address that together. And finally, and perhaps the least of them that I personally consider, is overlaying pictures. And I say the least because I really want to rely on that as less as possible, because I really don't find that relying on simply overlaying pictures, references on top of our 3D model, and just painting by numbers, I just don't really find that that is a great way to develop our own observational skills. Here's two different approaches to overlaying your references that are very useful to do. The first one is to simply duplicate your active viewport. So let's go here once again to View. Let's go to Area. Let's go to Duplicate Area into New Window. And then either keep this on as a separate monitor, or even if you have only one monitor, you can do this here. We'll just keep this here. We'll maximize this particular viewport. We'll give it a particular angle that we want. We're essentially doing the same thing that we have done for our first technique once we had those quad views here. We simply want to bring our PureRef window over. I have it right here. We want to select a particular angle. Let's go for this one here. Actually, her mouth is open, so maybe I don't like this one here. No, I guess this one's fine, even though she's looking a little bit on the side. That is completely okay. So we want to do the same thing that we have done when we were talking about the quad view here. You take one picture, you make it bigger here. Control, Alt, Shift, hold that down so that you can play with the transparency of this here. And then simply match these as well as you can. And really worry about matching as closely as you can the position of the facial features. And of course, in this particular case, it's normal for her eyes to not be in the exact same spot, or at least the iris is there because she's looking forward on our 3D model and she's looking on the side on our reference there. And you really want to take the time to really be as careful as you can with this. Don't be afraid, once again, here to play with your field of view, of course, with your angle of view, focal length on your camera to try and match as well as you can what is happening within your reference. But I feel as if there's actually quite a lot of perspective distortion on this particular reference. So I probably don't want to go higher than maybe around 60 or so. This picture is actually quite distorted because I think they took this picture. If you watch the movie, this is from Sicario. If you watch the movie, I believe they had the camera within the car. She's within the car right now. I believe they had the camera within the car, which means that the lens really can't be all that long, really. And then if you have a second screen, of course, you could either keep these as overlays like these, of course, and then just address the opacity of your PureRef window. Look at where the features are falling. Once again, here we can see that the nose is slightly lower than where it should be when we compare our 3D model with our references here. The silhouette matches pretty well overall. Our ear clearly is a little bit too low, which is actually interesting because that's actually what anthropometry has told us before, right? Our ear was slightly too low. And now we can actually confirm that with this particular reference. So that's actually pretty cool. We can clearly see that our ear is slightly lower than where it needs to be. And so we can either keep this just like this on a separate monitor, since this is a floating window. We could actually maximize this on a second screen and then just move our PureRef window over and then just play with the opacity and kind of see where things are falling. So that's the first way that we can overlay our two references. What I actually prefer to do, and this is really just a personal preference. There really is nothing all that special about it. You can use whichever approach that you want, but I just like to do it this way, okay? I just like to instead go within Photoshop, create a new document here, take a screen grab. I'm using GreenShot, by the way. If you want a free way to take some screenshots, there is, of course, the snip tool that comes with Windows, but I prefer to use GreenShot personally. I just find it slightly easier. So that's what I'm using right now, by the way. It's a free software. You can find it online if you're interested by that. If you want to take a full screen capture, you just press Control Print Screen to do that. It opens this little dialog window. And then you can do copy to clipboard. So that's what I do to take my screenshots here. Make the opacity here of PureRef completely opaque. Take a screenshot. Go to Photoshop. Paste that in here. Get rid of PureRef here. So let me just, in fact, I can even just move this off the screen. I don't even need it anymore. Take a screenshot here of our 3D model. Go back within Photoshop. Paste that on there. And then that simply allows us to just toggle like this back and forth. And personally, I just prefer that. I just find that a little bit easier just to toggle one button on and off and actually spot the differences as opposed to try and have to play with an opacity slider there. And that's the basic idea. I want to be just carefully looking at the differences there between our 3D model and our reference, and we want to be addressing those. You can see also the mouth position is not exactly there. The nose is not exactly there. The glabella seems to match pretty well. Feels my glabella is slightly wider, just ever so slightly wider than it needs to be. And then the silhouette here, there's also a few adjustments that need to happen here, as you can see. And the basic idea here is that as we work on our main screen, as we do changes, let me just pull something here very quickly. If I take something and I just move it like this, right? It's very, very ugly. I don't know what I'm doing here, but because we have this second viewport here that we have duplicated either on a separate screen, or if you have only one screen, if you're working on a laptop, let's say, and you only have one screen, the great thing is that this is a viewport that you can also just minimize as you're working within your main viewport. As you're working within your main viewport there and doing your changes there, you can bring your second viewport back up once in a while and then take a screenshot of there once again, go back to Photoshop and just paste that on top, which will allow you to first see the changes, see the difference between where was your starting point and where you are now. But of course, you can compare that with your reference to see have you gotten yourself closer or further from your references. The last tip I just want to give you as far as this is concerned is that if you are overlaying your references within Photoshop, you can obviously move your reference around if you're not matching 100%. You can actually move this around. This is not a PureRef window anymore. This is a screenshot. And so I can actually move this particular layer around. I can rotate it. I can do a whole bunch of stuff. And the great thing about that is that you can use the difference or the exclusion blending mode here. And what that allows you to do once you put that onto your reference layer, so you can easily see what are the differences. As the name of the blending mode implies, you can more easily see usually where are the differences between your reference and your 3D model, which will help you just to fine-tune the exact placement of this particular reference. And yeah, so then what you want to do is to just play whack-a-mole, really. You just want to spot the differences. You're like, okay, so the back of the nostril, although it actually looks like the tip of the nose needs to be brought down a little bit. Although we can also see that our nose is too wide here as I compare. So my nose is definitely too wide right now. Probably needs to be brought up a little bit. So you can see all the little minor differences there that are really starting to appear to us very easily that we really would have a hard time to spot otherwise. You can, of course, have multiple windows open at the same time. Here we have duplicated only one viewport. You can have multiple viewports. You could combine all these different techniques the way that you want them to create your own approach, your own killer workflow to really find and hunt for those little differences between your reference and your 3D model. All right, so those are the three different approaches that we can use. We will go through and we will use these three different techniques separately to improve our head from 80% all the way up to 90%. And that is the next part of this particular class. We will start by using the quad view approach, where we will really hunt for differences there. And afterward, we will move on to use anthropometry, and we will finish by using the overlay method to spot the final differences that we will address. There is no set order that you should use. In fact, I think it may even be smarter than what I have done to start with anthropometry. Really start with that because that is a very objective way to judge whether your proportions are right or wrong there. It's not subjective, it's not relative. This is what the exact ground truth is, and therefore, are you within the ground truth? Are you within reality or not? And if you're not within reality, then probably that should be addressed first. So actually starting with anthropometry probably makes a lot of sense, as long as there are anthropometrical issues that need to be addressed. We have not completed the second pass. So let's go ahead and improve this head together from 80% all the way up to 90%. So here we are. This is our Blender first pass that has been completed, and we are now starting the second pass over this particular head. We'll use the quad view technique to have multiple viewpoints over our head as we begin sculpting on this. So we'll start by duplicating our viewport 4 times, and then we will bring in PureRef, and we will choose our angles that we want to use. Because we've already covered how to set this up, I'm just going to speed ahead here until we are ready to start sculpting. Here's our 4 views that I have selected. You can see that we are getting a nice range of different angles over the face. They're all slightly different than the typical front view, side view profile, but that's all right. We still have a very complete picture over what we are trying to do here. As we begin sculpting on this and improving this particular head, you can see that I have turned off symmetry because the further along that we get with a likeness, the more that the asymmetry in a face becomes important to really judge whether we have properly captured a likeness or not. There's a lot within the asymmetry of a face that really tells us whose face that is, and sooner or later we have to stop working with symmetry if we want to really truly capture a likeness properly. So at this particular point, at our second pass point, it becomes a pretty good point for us to turn off symmetry for the most part. Now, we can still turn on symmetry when we want to do some pretty major changes to proportions, and we don't really care about those being asymmetrical. We just want to do them the same on the left and right side, of course. But for the most part, I'm trying to work asymmetrically as much as I can. And even if I try to do the same change on both sides of the face, the fact that I am doing them asymmetrically will really help me to just have a little bit more of that subtle asymmetry that people can unconsciously perceive, which will simply help to make a better face in the end. I really wasn't a big fan of all those big wrinkles that I had put on the forehead there. I kind of tried to capture a bit of a facial expression there, but I'm not all that satisfied with the result that I got here. So I think it's actually better for us to just get rid of that and go for a more neutral face. And once we've successfully captured the likeness better, then we can think about whether we want to bring back a facial expression in there or not. One of the key differences when I look at the face between all those different references that we have is really the fact that I really have to shave down quite a lot of that bone here over the forehead. If we look at the forehead and if we look at the curve that we have, we can see that we really don't have the same curve right now between our forehead on our 3D model and our reference. On our reference, the curve of the forehead, it seems to be a lot more consistent. It's a lot more convex all the way throughout. Whereas on my case here, there seems to be a bit of a concavity to the curve of the forehead here from 3/4. So this is really what I want to start with. I want to start by trying to address that, try to get a curve to the forehead that matches the references a lot more, which in turn also means shaving down a little bit the brow bone, because the brow bone right now is a little too prominent. So I'm really doing changes here to try and expand from front view the forehead on the sides a little bit, so that once we do look at the 3/4, that we have a little bit more of that mass that is right here. But at the same time, it's kind of obvious to me too that the eyes, they feel as if they're a little too far forward, especially as we compare with the bottom of the views that we have here. Even though her eyes are closed, it's kind of obvious to me that the eyes need to be pulled back within the skull a little bit. And the other references that we have here also seem to suggest that. If we look at this one here, it also feels as if the eye is just a little bit more cavernous than what I currently have. So this is a change that while I'm doing it, I'm actually looking at all of the different angles that I have. And also by bringing the eyes down slightly, not just further inside of the skull, but also by bringing them down slightly, I seem to simply be inching a little bit closer to the references. If you look at the change now, at the result of that particular change, of having to change the eyes, position of the eyes here a little bit, you can see that I'm actually already matching a lot better the references that I have there. So every time I do a particular change like this, especially using all these different views that I have at my disposal, I want to make sure that that change agrees with all the views that I have. If I do a change, but it seems to be bringing one of these views closer to its reference, but the other views seem to be moving away, then the change that I'm doing isn't a good change. I need to think about my strategy once again. Clearly, my nose is a little bit too wide, so we need to also make that a little bit narrower. And you can also see, if you compare the curve of the nose here, how I seem to have a little bit of a, like the tip of the nose seems to stick out here a little bit, whereas on our references here, the tip of the nose seems to be relatively straight and round there. So we have some minor adjustments that we need to do here to the curve of the nose. Another thing that is very clear to us right now is that our eyelids are simply too thick. If we compare the thickness here that we have for our lids, between our lids and our reference, you can see that in general, our lids seem to be a lot narrower. They're not as high, if you will, on our references as we have on our 3D model there. Now, some of that is because of the eyelashes, of course, but for the most part, our lids simply are too big right now. And she clearly has a lot of very subtle differences in terms of the shape of her eyelids between her left and right eye there. So this is yet again one of those places where it's actually better to go with that using asymmetry as opposed to try to make changes here that are symmetrical, because the asymmetry in her eyes is something that I consider to be very important to her essence there. At the same time, as we do look at this reference here, you can see how there seems to be a slightly sharper line here. It seems to be a bit of a plane change that just seems to be just slightly stronger here where my cursor currently is versus what I have here. So this is another one of those things I kind of want to try and try to tighten up here just a little bit as I can. But yet critically on the other side, and this is perhaps true for the reference that I have here, but there doesn't seem to be a plane change as strong happening on the other side of the nose there. So this is yet again one of those details that we want to pay attention to asymmetrically and try to address in an asymmetrical way. Still trying to shave down that brow bone just a little bit. You can see how we are closer to the shape that we have here on our reference now for the curve of the forehead, but we're still not completely there. It feels as if there's still some changes that need to be done here. I've smoothed out the crease within the eyelid, and now I am simply resculpting the little piece of skin that is dangling on top of the top eyelid. I'm just resculpting it so that it's hanging a little bit lower, and which gives us a top eyelid that just seems to be slightly narrower there. I'm doing this asymmetrically because she clearly has asymmetrical eyes, and that is very important for me to really start to really properly capture that at this particular stage. Of course, had we transferred this over from being in remesh over to a proper topology, we would have to use probably a different approach to changing the size of this particular lid, to changing the shape of it. We would probably rely more on smooth brush than we would rely on our sculpting brushes. And you can already compare here the changes in eyelid thickness here between her left eye and her right eye and the kind of difference that it makes. It's clearly bringing us closer to our reference. And so we have this other view that is here that allows us to see what is the thickness of the right eye. She's not looking ahead, of course, so we do have to keep that in mind, but we can clearly see here once again that our eyelids need to be reduced in terms of thickness. There's some very interesting things happening with her cheekbones, because if you look at the top left reference that we have here, if you look at the size of the highlight, if you look at how wide this is here in terms of the highlight here, and you compare with the reference, you can see that the highlight should be narrower than what we have. This is very, very thick as compared to this here, which is actually very narrow. So it means that the plane change that I have from this kind of forward-facing plane here to the side plane here of the cheeks, it's not where it needs to be right now. I really need to find a way to reduce either the prominence of the cheekbones or just reshape this particular surface so that our highlights match more between our reference and our 3D model. So what I'm doing is that I'm essentially just trying to shape where is the angle change happening here. You can see that there's a nice kind of sharp, almost somewhat sharp plane change that's kind of starting to happen here. So we have a plane on the side, we have a plane on the top, and that's really what I'm trying to control. I'm trying to control where that plane change happens, all the while I'm reading the light and how the light reacts with the surface to really make sure that I've placed that at the proper location. The bottom right angle is very interesting because there's some clear differences in terms of the silhouette, right? If we look at the shape here of the brow bone, how much of the brow bone we can actually see versus here, what is the distance between the cheeks and the brow bone, how much do the cheeks stick out versus the brow bone there. There's some clear changes that need to happen there, but it's not clear how to go about fixing that though. If I just take the brow bone and just make them wider, just using the move brush, it's not really clear that I'm going to wind up where I want to wind up for the other views. I may just wind up making the brows, the cheekbones just look like way too wide than they probably should be. So we can spot some differences there, but it's not clear right now how we're supposed to go about addressing that. So it's good to put that change on the side for now and just revisit this later. It's never a waste to spend time tweaking the eyes and really carefully looking at the shape of the eyes, looking at the shape of the eyelids and the eyelid creases. And we want to be hunting, this is not a perfect straight curve, as you can see. There's a bit of a flatter segment here. There's a bit of an angle break here. There's a bit of a flatter segment there as well. There's a segment here that's more constantly curvy, if I can call it this way. And then there's a flat segment there too. So we want to be carefully analyzing the shape of these kind of creases, especially around the eyes. That's very, very important. We're still exactly using the same brushes. Clay strips brush, fill brush. We're still using the grab brush to move some things around here a little bit. And so in terms of brushes, there's really nothing new here versus what we have done before. It's really just a matter of just spotting the differences and just refining, and refining. And a little bit of the basic draw brush is also very, very useful when we want to inflate a volume, but not necessarily introduce a whole bunch of artifacts as we would do if we were using the clay brushes there. There's some very interesting subtle anatomical differences between this particular reference here and our 3D model. You can see here, she's got a little bit of a puffiness within her orbital fat. There's a very interesting plane that is getting created here that is in a bit of shadows there. You really don't often see these kind of subtle anatomical details pop because most of these references, the lighting just doesn't really help to really sculpt those particular subtle plane changes happening on the orbital fat. You can see here on this particular reference here that this zone, it starts to look kind of flat. It's really hard to kind of see what's happening there, but once in a while, you get some of those nice references there where the lighting is just right and just allows you just to spot a few of those little anatomical subtleties there that are so important to really capturing a lifelike likeness, and yet that are also so hard to spot on most of these angles there. So once we do see some of those little details pop up, we want to really pay attention to them and really ask ourselves, okay, is my surface capturing right now that subtle anatomical detail that I'm looking at or not? So clearly here, there's some work to do on the orbital fat zone. You can see here, once again, that same little plane change that's kind of happening here. There's a bit of a flat zone that is right here, and there's this ever so slight plane change happening here, because you can see there's a bit of a shadow there. So there's some really beautiful interplay of shapes here around the orbital fat zone. And so what I want to do is to really just pull the surface out here just a little bit over the orbital fat zone. I just want to pull that out a little bit by just building a little bit of volume there using our clay brush, as you can see. And I'm trying to really shape the surface to really capture that nice subtle plane change at the orbital fat. If you take a look here from the same angle here, we're still not quite there. You can see if you compare the curves there, but we are getting a little bit closer and a little bit closer there. So yeah, you can see this is a very, very subtle detail, but it is also simply very important. And we really want to give a lot of time to each of these little anatomical details left and right when we do spot them to make sure that we are capturing them properly. But this is very much a detail-oriented work that we have to do at this particular stage. And the more that we know our anatomy, the more that when we do spot these subtle angle changes or the subtle plane changes on our references, the more that we are able to know what it is that we are even looking for, or that we are even looking at in terms of zone, in terms of detail there. So I know through studying anatomy that this particular zone here is the orbital fat zone. And the kind of subtle plane changes that we are looking at right now is very common to have that. Once you do know what are the subtle anatomical structures under the skin that are pushing up on the skin to create those subtle anatomical details and those subtle plane changes there, then you're able to spot those on your references and you know what you're actually looking at, as opposed to just imagine that that's just a random crease on the skin somewhere. So it actually helps a lot to know anatomy, and the further along we get with our likeness, the more that becomes important. So at this point, I'm still hunting for differences. You can see now, if we look at our angles here, once again, the shape of our chin really isn't there, okay? like we have a bit of a concavity here to our silhouette, whereas we don't have much of a concavity here. This is more or less a straight line that goes from the side here of the mouth all the way to the tip of the chin there. We have more or less a straight line here, whereas I seem to have a slight concavity here just a little bit. So we do need to address that. Either we need to bring the chin in, or we need to take this particular silhouette that is here, pull it out a little bit. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm just trying to play around with the fat that's on the side of the mouth here to try and bring that silhouette here to be a little bit closer. You can see on all these references how deep is the crease for the lower eyelid and how strong of a plane change there is here. If you take a look here, so this is a very, very, very flat and downward facing plane, and then here we reach a crease, and then the skin afterward is kind of pointing ahead and slightly up there. So there's a very, very strong crease here, and it's very important for me that I've really captured this crease as strongly on my 3D model as it is on our reference. And once again, it's a matter of just reading the light, reading what seems to be darker, what seems to be lighter, and just thinking through, okay, like what is the orientation of that particular zone of the face based on the lighting that I can see here. So we're shaving off a little bit of the chin to try and reach that straight line that we were talking about here. You can see now that this is starting to look pretty good to me. I'm starting to be a lot happier with that. We're still moving around, of course. We're still in that mentality of trying to move around the face as much as we can. For our third pass over the face, that's when we will really develop that purposeful tunnel vision on certain zones to really make sure that they're like exactly 100% the way that they need to be, because we'll need to be extremely focused on a lot of these facial features there. But at this particular stage, for our second pass, we still want to be dancing around the surface a little bit there. And we can already as well see the changes that need to happen to the ear. You can see that the neck is clearly way too thick on my 3D model as it is on my reference. In fact, if I'm looking here, how much of the neck I can see behind the jawline, and I'm comparing that with our reference, you can see that we really don't see much of the neck behind the jawline here, but I'm seeing a lot of it behind the jawline in this particular case. So there's some clear changes that need to happen here. There's another interesting subtle anatomical detail in this particular zone here. If you take a look at the shadows, once again, there's a slight shadow that's kind of teardrop shaped if you follow my cursor right now. And so it means that this spot here is just slightly in shadows, which means that the top here sticks out just ever so slightly towards the outside. So there's a very nice, just some very nice subtle anatomical changes there that I really haven't captured that much. So what I want to do is to try to really push in the surface here just a little bit and then pull out the brow bone that is right on top of it until I start to get a shadow profile or a shading profile, perhaps, that matches a lot closer to our reference. So it means just pulling out ever so slightly the brow bone and then pushing in ever so slightly the part that is under the brow bone at the corner of the eyelid there. With all these changes, it's very easy to go too far, and you always have to just try to really constrain yourself, really just make these things only subtle anatomical details as opposed to just sculpt them so strongly that they really start to deform the silhouette of the character. And that's probably one of the bigger challenges really of doing likeness sculpting, is really trying not to push things too far, because it's always kind of a little bit too easy to make the volumes a little bit too prominent there, when the key is really all in the subtlety of things. Still using our clay strips brush, but I'm using it with a very, very, very small radius, as you can see, because I really want to very gently and through multiple brush strokes be always inching myself slightly closer and slightly closer to the particular volume that I can see on our reference. While I'm doing that, I'm also using the top and bottom view, and I'm always reading the silhouette here of the brow bone. See, this is one of those complex things. We feel as if we need to pull out the brow bone here a little bit to kind of match the reference that we have here. And yet, if we pull the brow bone out too much, then it's obviously going to stick out too much in relation to the reference that we have here. So this is the kind of tightrope walk that we have to do. We have to somehow match one reference while not destroying the model the way that it looks in another reference. So sometimes it means that we may want to pull out a little bit of this mass here, but then take a bigger move brush and pull in the like a bigger mass, so that although we have those subtle variations that we are looking at, overall the mass still winds up in the same position. We have here the separation here between what we call the nasolabial fat, and there's probably a bit of other deeper fat pads in here too as well. But this particular line that is here, this is the separation really between our nasolabial fat and the rest of the cheek and the rest of the cheek fat that is there. So the fact that we can kind of spot this little subtle line here, we really cannot see that on a lot of our other angles, but it still should be there. And that's always because of how the light reacts with the surface there. But clearly, there is a very slight plane change happening here. And so as much as possible, we want to capture it, but capture it in an ever subtle way. We really don't want that to be too strong. And I'm still fighting with this particular plane change that you can see. The one that is here with this very nice tight highlight that is right here under my cursor. You can see that I'm still fighting that. In fact, sometimes I like to just draw a very sharp line like this that I have done over a surface to be like, okay, this is where that plane change needs to happen. And then shape the surface on on both sides of that particular line until it is exactly the way that I want it to be. So I'm trying to do these changes slightly symmetrically. I'm just working on one side, and then the changes that I have done, I try to propagate them on the other side afterward, doing that asymmetrically. But ideally, I would actually just bring up references from the other side of the face, and I would compare those. And so we do have here a 3/4 from the other side of the face that we can also kind of look at the subtle anatomical changes there. But ideally, I want to always, every change that I do, I want to make sure that they are valid for both the left and the right. If I do decide to do a change on the other side of the face, I do want to validate with my references that that change needs to happen there as well. Because for these very subtle anatomical structures, they will often vary quite a lot between the left and right side of the face. So it's not because something needs to happen on the left side of the face that it should happen on the right side. But I am taking advantage of the fact that I am doing something on one side of the face to ask myself the question whether that should happen on the other side as well. From this particular angle, you can see there's actually there's some important deviations. First of all, this subtle kind of trough that I've been sculpting here is probably slightly too deep compared to the reference here because we don't quite see it that well. But also the curve itself, the curve seems to be slightly more pronounced here, what I have versus what is happening on the silhouette there. And this particular reference here is really giving me quite a hard time here. I need to pull the cheekbones out. This curve here is too convex when compared here. This is flatter here, this is straighter. But also it seems as if the brow bone needs to be pushed inward quite a lot, right? If you kind of look at how much of the cheekbone is actually sticking out. It's almost tempting to just disregard this particular view, but do that at your own risk, really, because if one of your views doesn't match, then it means that there is something that is off somewhere, and it is your job to figure out what is going on here. You can see with all the changes that we have done, we need to pull the cheeks out as we have defined here. The cheeks, they do stick out quite a lot. when we look at this particular view here. But then when we look at this view here, if we pull the cheeks out too much, then we are actually destroying the silhouette here that we have. So this is the tightrope walk that we have to do. We have to find out, okay, how can I expand the cheekbone, make them look wider while at the same time keeping the same silhouette that I have here, which in our case actually means that we probably need to pull the cheekbones out further towards the back, because as we have defined before, the widest point of the cheekbones is actually further back than most people think it is, while leaving the front of the face to have the relative same size or width that it had before. This view here is great to really look at the size, look at the shape of the jawline here. You can see that I do have quite a lot of differences there as well. First of all, we can actually appreciate here the masseter, but we can also appreciate how narrow it seems to be. We can actually follow the line of the masseter here. If you follow my cursor here, you can see there's a beautiful clear straight line here that really spells for us where is the front border of the masseter here. And on my sculpt, things look a little bit muddy. You can see that there is kind of a bit of a line here, but it's not too much. It's not enough at a diagonal. It needs to be brought back a little bit. So we can address that here, and we can sculpt this zone and try to bring the masseter a little bit closer on our 3D model than what we have on our references there. I probably could have sculpted the masseter zone asymmetrically. There's not necessarily a hard rule here as to whether or as to why I have turned on symmetry in this particular case. It just felt like a change I wanted to do symmetrically, because I know that both sides of the face, the masseter really needed quite a lot of tweaks there. So that's why I turned on symmetry in this particular case, but it's not something that I necessarily want to keep on for too long either. One thing we want to do at this particular stage is to also read the shading within the shapes. We obviously don't want to read just the silhouette, but we also want to look, okay, where does, let's say, the shadows wind up, let's say, on the cheeks here, right? And we can see a beautiful straight line here that delimits the bottom of a shadow. So there's a clear plane change happening there. And our goal here is obviously to, once again, to shape the surface until those highlights match and those shading differences wind up being in the same position. You can see the shape of my jaw is really not there right now. We do have quite a lot of changes that need to happen there. Just like when we were doing the sketch, I am dancing around. I'm not staying at only one spot because, once again, I want to improve everything everywhere all at once. I don't want to develop tunnel vision at this particular stage because we're still too far in terms of proportions, in terms of likeness. We're still too far. So we still want to be in that mentality of, okay, I need to improve the likeness globally. And as long as we can spot major changes, then it means that we're just not there yet. But of course, the biggest question that I always have within my mind is, okay, but let's get the major things down as well as we can, as fast as we can. So position of the eyes, position of the mouth, position of the nose, and the size and the shape of the skull. Those are the most important things. Once we are confident that these are exactly where they need to be, then all the other volumes around them become a lot easier to shape and to place properly. And of course, there are the ears too that I haven't mentioned, but that are actually pretty important too. So don't forget to also make sure that those are well placed before you really start to let yourself get into tunnel vision mode. There's some beautiful, very subtle angle and plane changes happening here, right? You can see the slight highlight that is here, there's a slight shadow that is here. If you follow my cursor, there's a slight kind of sort of bottom border to this kind of major plane that is here on the side of the cheek there. Some very, very beautiful, subtle anatomical structures that seem to appear to us on this particular reference here. So I really, really love this one. And our job, once again, is to really just very subtly take our clay strips brush and shape and shape and shape the surface until we are capturing those nice angle changes and those nice subtle plane changes that we can see there. I'm really looking for the collective action of all my brushstrokes. That's why I'm not actually putting a lot of pressure on my tablet most of the time for most of the changes that I'm doing. And I'm not even worrying too much about trying to have a very specific directionality with these different brushstrokes that I have. I'm really just trying to build the volumes the way that I perceive them. And I'm fine with the fact that I'm winding up having a lot of those very sketchy artifacts over the surface, because we can always polish it later, of course. This is a really good 3/4. Although she's not looking straight ahead, we can clearly, beautifully see the silhouette and the facial features as well. So this is a really, really good angle to work from. And once again here, you can see that the kind of slight concavity that is right here under my cursor. It's so slight, right? It's so subtle, but there is clearly a little bit of a depression there on the skin, or rather on the bone at that particular point. So subtle, very, very, very subtle. But if it's there, then it means that we need to capture it. This forehead is definitely giving me a hard time, because you can see that we're still not there. It's like our brow bone is just too prominent. If I compare the brow bone here to our reference, we really shouldn't see that much of the brow bone here just kind of stick out here. But it's not as much that the brow bone sticks out too much as the fact that the forehead isn't forward enough. So there's something about the forehead here that needs to be addressed, as you can see. We still have that slight concavity here, ever so slight concavity here, whereas we should have a convexity here. So our forehead still isn't there, and we still need to improve it. Around the jowls here, we can see a little bit of jowl fat. This particular mass here is a little bit of jowl fat that she has. And so we can see the bottom border of it. It kind of creates a bit of a circle like this around the bottom border of this particular jowl fat compartment. If you don't really know, or if you've never heard about the jowl fat, this is explained through the facial anatomy classes that we have, especially the one on facial fat. So I would suggest you go and you watch that there. But once again, here you can see some subtle anatomical details. And when we do know our anatomy very well, it becomes very easier to simply put words and to understand the full shape of what it is that we can see that may seem to be only merely suggested within our references there. So studying facial anatomy is very, very, very good, and it's very important to capturing proper likenesses. Our neck has been reduced, but I feel as if we could probably still make it slightly narrower still. Still using the clay strips, very low intensity. And once again, just very slowly, very methodically building some of those volumes, pushing the surface in, pulling the surface out. I don't care about the artifacts that are over the surface at this particular stage. It's not important. I really want to make sure that the volumes are how I want them to be before I start to worry about whether the surface is polished enough or not for me. If you really want to successfully capture eyes and really get this zone to read exactly the way that it should be, eyes are very, very important, because they're obviously, what we call the window to the soul there. They are the thing that we look at usually when we do look at people, right? So the eyes are extremely important. And if there is one zone of the face that you probably should spend some time to study, its anatomy in great detail to make sure that you know every little subtle anatomical structure that is there that contributes to shape. The eyes is the place where you want to spend the most of your time, because that is the place where most people will look at most of the time. And so if the eyes aren't there, everything else just won't follow. But if you capture the same eyes as you have on your reference, the rest of the face can be slightly off, and yet the reference will still look, and yet the likeness will still look like it is very successful there. So the eyes are the most important part for you to focus on if ever you have limited energy to spend, but you want to learn anatomy. There's quite a lot going on around the eyes, from the orbital fat under the eyes to the eyelids themselves and what is at the corner of the lids, what we call the medial and the lateral canthal tendons that hold the actual eyelids in place. So learning about eyes and really learning everything that you can about the anatomy of the zone of the eyes will really pay dividends for you in the future. Through all the changes that we have done, you can see that our 3/4 from the back here, it's getting closer, but we're still not there, right? Like it still feels like as if there's a little bit too much mass here to the brow bone, just a little bit as compared to our reference here. And so we've gotten fairly close, but we're still just not there. There are still some key differences around this particular zone. And I suspect we won't be able to fix those until later, because at this particular stage, we've been using this particular quad view approach since the beginning here, and we're actually getting fairly close. Our likeness is a lot closer now than where we had started, but we haven't looked at this head through the lens of anthropometry, and that's actually going to hurt us because we don't actually know whether our proportions are right or not. You know, we could have some perspective distortion built into the face right now, and we don't even really know about it. Or we could have some perspective distortion built within the face, but we've been addressing everything else around that until those look quote unquote good, where that perspective distortion just becomes very, very hard to spot, but would still kind of hold us from being able to successfully complete this particular likeness there. So sooner or later, we have to really look at this through the lens of anthropometry, and that's going to be the next step that we will do here. We're really, really close here, so we've probably gotten as close here, or about as close here as we'll be able to get using this particular quad view approach here. And it's really good not to delay really measuring things very carefully with anthropometry. It's really good to delay that for not too long, because if there are some really nasty surprises that do appear to us when we do start to look at the measurements here very precisely, we want to address those as soon as possible. So I probably even should have started with that. I probably should have started with anthropometry and really measuring everything very carefully before even moving on to this quad view approach. Because you'll see once we do the anthropometry pass, we're actually going to, for a while, end up further from our likeness than where we currently are. But it's going to be one of those cases of one step back, two step forwards kind of thing. It's very awkward to look at faces when they don't have any eyebrows. So I like to just use the clay strips brush, as you can see, with slightly more pressure, and just sculpt where the eyebrows should be. Again, this is very sketchy. We don't want to spend too much time on this. And it's fine if we have to destroy this because we want to shape the brow bone differently. We can just recreate those later. But at least having that little bit of extra clay on top here really helps us to read the zone of the eyebrows a lot better. So this is as close as we'll get. This is actually fairly close, right? When we look at the reference, when we look at the 3D model, they're very, very close together. There really doesn't seem to be that much of a difference between our 3D model and our reference here. But this is actually only a lie, because at the beginning of the class, when we were going through these 3 different techniques that we're using right now, we could actually spot that there was some major deviations in terms of some of our facial measurements, notably for the interpupillary distance there. There were some very, very big changes there. And I'm still carrying those changes here because I haven't actually did any sort of adjustment following that measurement that we have done at the beginning there, I haven't changed the distance between the eyes. So there's actually some nasty surprises that we have to address. And although we may want to resist doing those changes because we feel as if we are close enough, and as you'll see very soon, it's going to ask us to actually take a step back in terms of how much this face seems to match our reference, in terms of how well we've captured the likeness. Anthropometry, well, it's something that's subjective, right? Like we know, like we're getting these measurements through science, through just looking at thousands of faces and really just measuring things like interpupillary distance across thousands of faces. So it is objective. If we don't have proper measurements when we look at the anthropometry, we have to conclude that there are issues with our head that needs to be addressed. And so we have to address those sooner rather than later is better. Okay, so it's now time to look at this head through the lens of anthropometry and really figure out what is going on with the proportions there. I have already alluded to the fact that we have issues with our interpupillary distance over this head, and so we will have to address that now. Even though the head looks like it's kind of close, the fact of the matter is that if some of our major anthropometrical measurements just are completely off, then we really just can't say that we have reached our goal of creating a successful likeness. And so let's measure here once again what is the interpupillary distance between our two eyes here. So we select the measuring tool and then we simply hold Control. We click and drag and we take a series of measurements like these to see what are the different lengths and distances that we have over the head here. So we can see our interpupillary distance at 5.43 centimeters. We have our head breadth here at 15 centimeters. We have our head length that is at about 19 centimeters or 18.8 centimeters or so in our case here. If we look at the height now from the trachea to the top of the head, we have a value here of about 13 centimeters or so. And you can see we're just slightly over the average, which is fine. It's not that big of a problem, but we could definitely move the eyes, or rather move the ears up very slightly to really get that value down to be nicely within the middle of our range there. Next, let's measure the distance between the two cheekbones, or the zygomatic bone here. So here our value is somewhere around 12.45, as you can see, which, as we have talked before, is slightly lower than the average, which is somewhere around 13 centimeters or so. And finally here, we want to add this particular measurement from the menton all the way to the cilion to complete our picture in 3 dimensions of the proportions of our head here. So the differences in terms of depth, in terms of height of the head, they're very minor. They're really not all that far off. But what's really, really concerning here is the fact that the interpupillary distance is 5.43 centimeters, and that is way, way lower than where it should be. It means that we need to make the eyes further apart. That's what it means. We need to make the distance between the eyes bigger. But comparing our 3D model with our reference, it's really not all that clear by comparing our 3D model with our reference that the eyes should be further apart, right? In fact, the eyes, they look like they're kind of where they need to be right now. And that's really, really problematic because you can imagine that if I just take the eyes and I move them further away from each other to fix the interpupillary distance, now we can imagine that she's going to look completely off in terms of proportions. Like her eyes are going to look, they're way further than they should be. And so that's a problem. So the question is, how do we move the eyes further away from each other by a few millimeters each, and yet still keep the overall proportions of the face? How do we go about doing that? Because that seems like those two things are kind of in contradiction there. Our eyes, visually speaking, when we look at our head, they seem to be the right distance from each other. And yet anthropometry tells us that they're clearly too far, or rather they're too close together and they need to be moved further apart. So how do we actually go about addressing that? And that's a question that I actually had to ask myself. And the answer to that is really just with using more anthropometry, because at this stage, I'm kind of the thing that is going through my mind is, okay, like if I move the eyes further apart, then, but I want them to look like they're at the same distance in between themselves. I want to move them further apart, but I want the eyes to look like they're the same size that what I have right now. Then what I have to do is potentially make the eyes also bigger at the same time. Not only do I have to move the eyes further apart, you can imagine if I move the eyes further apart, but I make them bigger, they will look like they have the same distance between themselves as what we have started with, right? So is that the solution that we need in this particular case? Well, the only way to really figure out whether that's the actual right answer or not is to ask ourselves a question. Okay, well, if I move the eyes further apart and I make them bigger, will I throw the rest of my measurements out of whack, or will I actually fix perhaps another problem that I don't actually know about that is currently over this face right now? So the question that I have quite simply is, okay, so what is the size of the opening of the eye? What is the palpebral fissure size right now? And does that actually fit within correct anthropometrical measurements right now? Or is that also off? Because if our eyes are too close together, but our palpebral fissure, the size of the opening of the eyes, is also too small, then we know that by moving the eyes further apart and making them bigger, they will look like they are at the same distance from each other, but they will fit within anthropometry. And the size of the opening of the eye then needs to be increased as well. And so the way that we can solve that is really just by starting to look at the anthropometry of the palpebral fissure. And here, if we Google that, so if we Google palpebral fissure anthropometry, we're going to get a range of different charts, people who have studied that particular question here. And so this is a particular chart that I have found here, and it's very interesting to compare the data that we can see here. So let's take here the size of the opening of the palpebral fissure in both the X and the Y axis. This is the X and this is the Y. So we have right now 2.7 centimeters for the width here of the palpebral fissure. And if we actually compare that with the data, you can see here, females, the average size is actually 30 centimeters, or 30 millimeters. So actually, our palpebral fissures are actually too small. So that's actually a potentially pretty good solution there. Make the eyes further apart from each other and also make the eyes bigger at the same time. But then the next question that we have to ask then is, okay, so is it just the opening of the eyes that is too small, or is it the eyes themselves? Is the sphere of the eye, is that also the problem? So by measuring here the size of the eyes, we're actually winding up having 2.45 centimeters as a width for the eyes. And it actually turns out that that's actually a very normal size for the eyes there. So a normal human eyeball will be about 2.4 to about 2.6 centimeters. Those aren't the exact values that you may get if you were to Google that in terms of anthropometry, but that's pretty much where you will end here. So I pretty much always make eyes that are 25 to 26 millimeters across, perhaps 24 depending on the face there. And that usually almost always gives you exactly the size of the eye that you need there. But that is also something that you could obviously Google as well. Look at anthropometrical charts of what is the normal width of an eyeball here. But I know by measuring it and seeing the value of 2.45 that I'm within the ballpark that I need to be here. So, okay, so our eyes have the proper size, but our palpebral fissures are actually too small. Also of note here is that the palpebral fissure width actually goes from the exact corners of the eyes to the exact corners of the eyes, as opposed to only be the eyeball itself. So our palpebral fissure is too small, but the size of our eyes is not. Our eyeballs have the proper size. We could actually increase the eyeballs by about a millimeter. That wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. We could actually do it in this case. And before we actually start to move things around, perhaps the last measure that we want to take a look at is the bizygomatic breadth here, that is called, or just the distance here. What is the distance between the cheekbones? And so the width of our cheekbones here, we have a value here of 12.45. And by looking at that in the context of anthropometry, we can see that the 50th percentile is actually closer to 13.5 centimeters, whereas we're at 12.5 centimeters or so right now, right? So that tells us that we have a solid centimeter that we can add to the width of the cheekbones. And I actually really, really like that, because if we do increase the distance between the eyes, if we make the palpebral fissures a little bit wider as well, if we don't actually move where the cheekbones are, it may actually start to make the size of the face a little bit squished. It may not look all that great here. But we can confirm here that our cheekbones are also too narrow. So it's not just the eyes, it's really the whole front of the face that's just a little too narrow there. That means that we can be confident that this change that we are about to do is a proper change. A great thing here is that when I take the move tool, I can actually move one of these eyes, and you can see on the top left that you can actually see the exact distance that I am moving this from. So we don't have to guess how far away we have to move these particular eyes. We can actually just move these very exactly here. So we have a value of 5.45 centimeters or so between our two eyes. And I do know that I want to be slightly lower than the average, because her eyes they just seem to me like they're slightly closer together than the average of the population there. So I don't necessarily want to hit that 6.2 centimeters that we have talked about. I want to be slightly lower than that. Let's say we start at 5.4, right? And we want to make it up to 6 or 6.1 centimeters. Then we need to essentially move the eyes over by what is about 0.6 centimeters, or what would be 0.3 centimeters for each eyeball. And this is the result. Now she looks a little derpy because the eyeballs have been moved out of their sockets here. And if we take the measurement here, we can see that we're actually slightly higher than the 6 centimeters that we have said, but we're still under that average. So I think that probably should be pretty good. We can always move the eyes slightly closer together later on if this is actually a little bit too far. And you can see what's the problem here, right? It's like the moment that we move the eyelids, you can see how the eyes now, they just seem to us like they're further apart when we look at our reference. Our eyes, they just look like they're further apart, but we have to trust that now they are at the proper distance, and we have to look for other ways to make it so that our eyes seem to be closer together than what they truly are. And our best approach here is to just increase the size of the palpebral fissure. Let's make the cheekbones a bit wider in the process, because we have seen that we have a pretty solid centimeter that we can go and gain there. And now let's just shape this, right? Let's just play around with pretty much everything else around these eyes and see if we can shape the surface enough to get rid of that perception that the eyes are further apart right now than what they actually should be. Another key reason why the eyes look like they're too far apart right now is because the size of the iris may not actually be where it needs to be right now. You can see I'm having a bit of a hard time here, but once I actually get this measurement down here properly. So you can see that I'm winding up here having an iris size that is actually too small. So once again here, I don't have an anthropometrical chart to bring up on screen, but you can there too just look at what is the average size or the average width of a human iris. That's also a very good thing to know. And I know from memory, if I remember correctly, that it's about 1.1 centimeter or so. And there again, of course, that will vary from person to person. But 1.1 centimeter, that's a pretty good measurement to try and hit there. And that means that I actually need to make my irises here just slightly wider there, which will in turn help with the feeling that the eyes are just too small. They're just a little bit too far apart here. So we're just going to use our fill brush here. We're just going to flatten here a little bit the irises to make them look like they're slightly wider than what we currently have. These are obviously sketchy eyeballs, which will get eventually replaced with high quality eyes, of course. But for now, yeah, see, so we're at about that 1.1 centimeter now for the width of the irises there. So I actually quite like that. This one needs to be slightly wider than this. All right, so that already helps to make the eyes look a little bit bigger than what they were before. And we can definitely move them just very slightly closer to each other there, because as we have said, I think that 6.13 centimeter that we had there, I think it's just slightly too much. I want to be lower than the average with the distance between her eyes, because that's just what it seems to me to be the case here, but not nearly as low as what we had before there. So see how the eyes are starting to read a lot better now? We've moved the eyes further away from each other, but in the process, we've also made the palpebral fissures bigger. We've made the irises bigger. All of these things help to contribute to give us the impression that our eyes are now the correct distance. But of course, because we have made the eyes further apart, now everything else seems to also be a little too narrow if we look at the jaw. And so we definitely have other things that need to be addressed now around the eyes to make sure that the face is back at capturing the likeness that we previously had. So at some point, we can definitely start to overlay our reference here. It's really not a bad idea because it's really going to help to confirm whether our eyes are now at the proper distance or not. This is a pretty good thing to do here. And you can see as I'm overlaying these two images here, we're really damn close now, actually, right? So this was actually the correct move to make the eyes further apart. But now if you look at the size of the jaw, you can see that now clearly the jaw is too narrow versus my reference here. The neck is too narrow. So that's actually the consequence. It's like, now that we fixed the distance between the eyes, everything else now looks like it's too narrow because it was well proportioned for the size of the eyes that we had or for the distance between the eyes that we had. So now we need to make everything else now wider to compensate for the change that we have done now. But yeah, here I'm just being very careful, really just doing this sort of overlay Photoshop trick, just really making sure, okay, that my irises are exactly the size that they need to be. The eyes are exactly where they need to be. And you can see that we're matching this almost precisely. Maybe there's a very slight millimeter off here and there. But for the most part, you can see the size of the eyes. You can see the position of the eyes, the size of the irises. Everything seems to be really, really, really damn close. Looking at our cheekbones now, you can see we're at 12.6 centimeters, which again is just slightly lower, right? If we look at our bizygomatic distance here once again. So that's actually pretty good because that simply confirms that we have to make all the side of the face, perhaps even everything, but the skull, the back of the skull is the proper size. And in fact, needs to be narrowed down a little bit, but everything else, the cheekbones, the jaw, the neck, all of that needs to be widened now. So this is one of those cases of one step back and two steps forward. While we are fixing those anthropometrical issues that we have mentioned, we will be taking a step back. We will lose in terms of likeness. It won't look as good in terms of likeness. It'll feel as if we're actually going in the wrong direction. So I started with those anthropometrical measurements, and now we are simply doing the overlay method here and really just playing whack-a-mole with the silhouette there. And really just making sure that the silhouette is as close as it can be. You can see how squished the perspective is on the reference too, by the way. So you can see, by the way, that I've increased the focal length of my camera here to 100 millimeters because it just seems like this particular image of Emily Blunt was taken with a very long focal lens here. You can see there's still some minor differences in terms of the position of the ear. So we can still move the ears further away from the head just a little bit. But this is getting extremely close, right? Ideally, those ears would be exactly matching, but there may be something else going on with the ear as well. Maybe they're too far forward, maybe they're too far back. There may be other slight issues with the ears. So let's just keep them like this for now, and let's just revisit them later if we need to. And look at our cheekbones now. So 13.4 centimeters or so, about that, right? So that's actually pretty good. That's really close to our average there of 13.5 centimeters. So our cheekbones are the proper size. Our eyes are the proper distance from each other. This is really, really getting very, very close here. So that makes me very, very confident. And now the great thing is that if everything has been proportioned properly, it means that we can use here a different front view. This is a different front view here than what we had before, where clearly the lens is shorter, right? The field of view seems to be higher than that. And so, because we can see how her face looks just a lot more narrow than what it looked like on the previous front view that we had, right? We should still be able to get a very close match here as we overlay these two pictures on top of each other. We should still be able to get a very, very close match if we have done everything properly and if we have also estimated what is the focal length of the camera well enough. So let's take a screenshot of our viewport. Let's take our reference. Let's overlay them once again within Photoshop, and let's once again try and spot where the differences are. But if we have done everything right so far, then it means that these really shouldn't be all that far from each other. So this is a very interesting test. And let's see where things fall now. She's obviously looking on the side. Our 3D model is looking straight ahead. We know that we won't be able to match those exactly because of that. But the corners of the eyes should wind up in the same position. The nose, the mouth, the size of the skull should very closely match. Not too bad, right? Not too bad. I do want to say that I do feel as if through those changes that we have done that I've actually lost a little bit of Emily Blunt's likeness, believe it or not, even though we know that we are objectively closer. I do feel, and you may feel this too, that I've actually taken a step back in terms of how much my likeness sculpt looks like Emily Blunt. And that comes from all the changes that we have done around the eyes and these sorts of things. And that's the nature of that one step back, two steps forward that we have done. Because now we know that our perspective is much better. We've gotten rid of that perspective distortion that we had over the face, or that camera distortion. Now that we know that the interpupillary distance is good, that it is where it needs to be, we know now that our proportions are extremely solid here. And look at how well that silhouette is matching here. So although we do seem to have lost a little bit of that likeness, we are much closer to the ground truth than where we were before. So bringing those subtle elements of the likeness back, bring that essence back within the face, really should be very simple to do from now on, now that we know that everything is exactly where it needs to be in terms of proportions. So that's going to be the goal for our third and last pass over this particular likeness sculpt. We will talk about things like skin pores and all these things, of course, but that will be after we are done really nailing down the actual likeness and after we have done a retopology there. So, but as far as capturing the likeness is concerned, there's really only one more pass that we need to do. Now that we know that everything is exactly where it needs to be, that we know that the anthropometry of our head is really, really solid, now that we know that everything is really where it needs to be, now we can simply concentrate on really going through every facial feature one after the other there and really capture both the essence, the exact essence of her face, and make sure that every anatomical structure of her face is exactly the way that it needs to be. So really develop that kind of tunnel vision over each facial feature one after the other there. We can do that now because we know that the proportions are really solid. We know that everything is where it needs to be. So yeah, I would call this the 90% mark. That last 10% really is to bring back the essence of the face that we have somewhat lost here a little bit through those major proportional changes that we have just done, and also simply go through every facial feature one after the other and make them look exactly like our reference there. So that's our last step, essentially, for in the process. Up next, in Blenderland, we will talk about the third pass over this head. So how to go from 90% to 95% and beyond in terms of a likeness. And also we will talk about how to transfer over this particular head from its remesh topology that it currently has over to a proper clean topology where we can use the multi-res modifier and on which we can start to create things like skin pores and fine wrinkles. So that's going to be up next, so keep an eye out on the website for our future Blender classes. Thanks for watching, everyone, and until next time, take care.